Welcome, friends of the Greasy Shop Rag. Today we're going to take a look at a Husqvarna K770 power cutter or concrete saw, whatever you want to call it. The customer complaint is that it wouldn't start. You can see here there's one screw that holds this carburetor and airbox assembly onto the saw. Now, things aren't always as they appear, and a lot of times what we see as the problem is just the result of the actual problem. You can see that the intake boot right there is torn, and that's why it won't start. It's getting too much air. But later in the video I'll show you how that happened. So first we're going to remove the fuel line from the side of the carburetor. And then we're going to remove the throttle linkage. Now the other fuel line just popped off the primer bulb. But then we're going to unsnap the throttle linkage from the throttle lever. It's just snapped in there. It's pretty easy to do. And right here is the rest of the broken intake boot. Now how did that happen? I mean, gremlins just didn't go in there and yank on it. It had to happen somehow, so we'll take a look at that later. Now I'm kind of manhandling this intake boot, taking it apart, you know, using a screwdriver there, but I don't care because I'm replacing that. This bottom one, I'm using my fingers on it because I don't want to wreck it. I'm not going to replace that bottom one. I'll reuse it. And then also the impulse hose is on here. We'll just gently remove that. Now, these things are always frickin' dirty.
Oh, come on now. That ain't even bullshit. That's horse shit.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of working on these. But I do need to clean it up. So we're going to keep the dirt out of the intake port there and stuff a rag in it. So now you see how much movement I have there between the motor and the handle assembly. Let's take a look at this anti-vibe spring on the front. You can see it's roached. Completely broken. So that allows a lot more travel between the engine and the fuel tank assembly, and the carburetor is bolted to the fuel tank assembly. So now those two pieces are traveling farther than they normally would, and that's what stretched that intake boot to the point of tearing. So just replacing the boot would have resulted in another torn boot. And like so many repairs, you need to figure out why it happened and not just react to the broken part that you're seeing. So let that be a lesson to you. Now in this situation, I didn't have a new anti-vibe spring or even a new intake boot for the customer, and he wanted the saw back. So that means we're going to put used parts in it. I don't have a problem with used parts if the customer doesn't have a problem with it. They know what we're doing, and they're willing to take the chances that the part might not have a full service life compared to a new part. But you know, so much of it with contractors is about cost and time. The equipment is down, so we try and keep as much of this oddball stuff laying around as we can just to get guys going again. And once I explain to them what happened, you know, the next time they feel that the saw is sloppy with a broken mount, they're not going to keep torquing on the thing because they'll know that there's going to be more labor involved in repairing broken intake boots and things like that. So now that I've got the anti-vibe spring fixed, we're going to do the intake boot swap. There's just 4 screws that hold this carb assembly to the air box. And we need to harvest some parts out of our used assembly. So that plastic piece, that just lets the intake boot hold its shape and stay mounted in that plate decent. You can see we're going to use we're not going to use all of it, because actually this main intake boot was just a little bit different style on the carburetor end. I didn't investigate what model it came from. I just dug through a box of parts till I found something close enough to work. And actually I probably didn't have the old one labeled as to what model saw it came out of.
Coward.
But you can see, you know, we're going to use our fingers here to gently put this back together, and no sharp tools or anything. We don't want to cut that boot. I'm going to wipe the bulk of the dirt off of that gasket, get the carburetor back in place, and run our 4 screws back in. And our plastic boot shape holder thingy. So putting this together can be a pain in the butt. The design is such that
What's the easiest way to do this?
the fuel line is really short on this side. You can't get in there with your fingers. One line is stacked on top of the other. The throttle linkage just kind of barely fits in there right, but you get it snapped in place and you're all good. And then the front of the intake there, it's kind of got a saddle that the bottom of it sits into. You got to get the see that right there? You got to get that intake down into that saddle, and then there's just that one screw on top that holds it together. But sometimes getting everything lined up, you know, more than once I put that screw in the top and then went back and looked, and the intake plate wasn't actually flush on the cylinder, and I've had to take it apart and do it again. But it looks like we're going to get this one on the first shot. Kind of a long shot, but we're going to get it. And it is hard to explain what's going on here. You need to do it once to know what a to know what a pain in the butt it is. And the last step here, don't forget to hook up your choke linkage. It's just a matter of getting the choke lever on the carburetor to sit in the saddle of the blue lever. But I've pulled them back apart again to redo that step because I forgot about it. So the machine runs. We're going to put it back together. Now, one thing I didn't mention when it was coming apart is that these little square nuts, I think there's 6 of them on here, they're going to fall out. And before, I think I found one of them on the floor. I can see one of them sitting over there on the right, way on the right, sitting on the rag. If you forget about them, they're going to fall out and you're going to have to look for them. So be aware of that. And they just sit in there, so you got to get them lined up so that the screws will, for the covers, will drop in there and get started. The other thing I want to point out is that the primer bulb is on this side here. And when you're taking that cover on and off, you kind of got to manipulate the primer bulb a little bit, usually to, at least to get it off. Not always when you're putting it on, but it seems like that primer bulb holds the cover up from wanting to come off. So we do have to get this boot, this fresh air intake boot, pulled up through that cover. We'll get our air filter put on. See, that's what I was talking about. Those nuts got to be lined up just right or the screws won't start. We'll get her put back together and do one final test run. That's all I got for you on the Husqvarna K770 power cutter. Thanks for watching. Later.